readers. I'm Emily with that's Henry, not with Telltale. Okay, you're gonna get put in the crate, little man. Oh my god. Alright, you're going. Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Emily. I'm with Telltale. Greg and I are going to be doing separate videos on the same literature because we're practicing social distancing. We hope you're all being responsible and enjoying your reading time now that you probably have most of it because you're all in quarantine. So today we are going to be talking about Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Huge fan of the Lovecraftian myth, especially because I actually got interested in it by getting involved in steampunk subculture. I used to go to cons dressed in steampunk and stuff like that. I had a lot of friends who played Call of Cthulhu in college. My husband and I have the Call of Cthulhu video game, so we really enjoy the mythos. What I do have to disclose is that I did not actually read Call of Cthulhu until about 6 months ago. I had been so involved in a lot of the mythos just from snippets of it and from being involved in steampunk culture and really enjoying classic literature and hanging out with a lot of very literarily oriented friends. I don't even know if that's a word. I just had a lot of book nerd friends who talked about it a lot, so much that I felt like I had read it. And I decided one day while I was on Spotify, I was gonna look it up and see if Spotify had audiobooks, and sure enough, they had it. So I listened to the whole thing in a day. It's a really fast read because it's compelling, and two, when you actually sit down and read it, it's not huge. Like there's a wealth of information, I think, over the course of the accumulation of stories, but the Call of Cthulhu mythos itself, not a very long piece of work. So if you're looking for a quick read and are interested in a series of short stories and different novellas and things like that, the Lovecraftian lore is a good place to start, especially if you're interested in sci-fi or fantasy of any kind, and especially if you're into horror or psychological thriller. Now, that all being said, let's talk about the premise. If you're not familiar with this myth, it is about a gentleman who has a family member or relative of some kind, I think it was an uncle, who passed away, and when he inherited all of his belongings, he started reading a lot of his notebooks and his research and finding that there were several people who started having a lot of the same kinds of dreams and experiences that all seemed to coincide with one another. They all were the same kind of dream with the same kind of thing, and most of the people, if not all of them, ended up going, actually it was all of them ended up going crazy after having this dream, and it all seemed to happen at the same time. So as he's accumulating all this knowledge from this passed away relative, he starts realizing that there are other people who have been corresponding with him about this information. So he goes and finds these people and starts collecting accounts of all these unusual circumstances that all seem to be linked to this particular date and coincide and have similar relationships to one another. So he's trying to kind of like piece together what's going on with these people who all seem to have these similar experiences. So it's a really fascinating story. One, because you have this who starts as a skeptic. He doesn't know whether to believe this story or not, but he continues to pursue it for the sake of intrigue. And plus he has time on his hands, apparently, because he can just go off and travel to wherever he wants and to the Miskatonic University and just hear all about all these strange happenings and stuff. So he just does. He starts kind of picking up the pieces of where his relative left off and starting to piece together the rest of this story. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, to his great distress and eventual alleged madness. We don't actually know at the end if he goes crazy or not. we can sense that he is, though, once he starts accumulating more and more and more information about, ultimately, one called Cthulhu. And it's pronounced multiple ways, so please don't hate me for pronouncing it the way I pronounce it. Some say it's Cthulhu, some say it's Cthulhu. Some can pronounce his full name, and it's 30 million letters long, and that's terrifying. So don't try. I didn't try. So I'm just pronouncing it Cthulhu. Sorry if I'm slaughtering it. This is America. We can slaughter whatever language we want. So, yeah. Little side note there. So this story is really interesting because it not only pulls from this regular guy kind of falling into this information and kind of happening upon it. He didn't ask to find it out. He didn't ask to become the person responsible for this information. He just kind of one day stumbled upon it, became a little intrigued, and then it just kind of consumed his whole life very quickly because it was such a strange phenomena to have happen. So you have this really regular guy character who just happens to find out this information, who gets thrusted into the storyline of chaos. So ultimately, what he discovers and what he's piecing together is there were these elder gods that people used to worship who were basically the epitome of chaos. As you read more and more and more into the myth, if you read more of Lovecraft stuff, you find that he kind of writes in the same universe. So all of these beings and monsters, which are very real, these are not things that, these aren't ghosts that, oh wait, somebody left a window open, or, oh, it's really was a human who did it. This is an actual monster causing supernatural phenomenon, and a series of monsters even causing supernatural phenomenon. And basically these beings are the beginning of the end. Cthulhu himself is sleeping, and when he wakes up, the world will be thrust into a living hell chaos. And that's kind of what this character ultimately ends up piecing together, is that these beings are real, they are terrifying, they are meant to enslave and cause chaos within humanity, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. Now, what's interesting about this storyline is that Lovecraft kind of pieces together this unusual concoction of very common fears. He takes fear of death as one, fear of a painful death even, an impending doom that cannot be stopped, fear of the unknown. He takes all these things and kind of builds them into this monster and into this storyline and into the series of monsters that kind of stem from this myth that he's developed. And even though these are really common fears that humans have, he just threw all of them in the pot. Like, he just took all of it and he was like, we're going to make this terrifying by taking everybody's inevitable fears and just throw it in there. And now we have one man who knows a lot about this stuff. But, one, if he hangs on to the information, it's going to consume him and drive him crazy. Two, if he tells people, it's going to spread and do the same thing. It's basically this pandemic of information. If people choose to believe him, it just sows the seed of this ultimate sense of hopelessness. And we don't know, in the story, it's not divulged to us when Cthulhu's going to wake up. So you have this fear of the unknown of when this ultimate doom is coming, and knowing it's going to be a painful, torturous, hell-like, raving madness kind of death. Like, it's going to be the end of all things as we know it. So it's very dystopian. It's very horrific and tormented. So Lovecraft just kind of threw it all in the pot and said, hey, we're gonna take everybody's worst fears and build it into this myth, which I can appreciate, because that really does make it very, one, complex, two, a huge burden to the mind and very thought-provoking. and especially to this particular character who ends up being our narrator, because you don't know at what point he's really starting to fall into madness as he's accumulating information, because he may have started the moment he started pursuing the entire thing. That may have been where the madness started. Or it could be at the end, spoiler alert, when he starts claiming he's fallen into madness. Now, who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him? We could sit and speculate that all day. What it ultimately comes down to is we have this doomed character who knows of the ultimate doom and can do nothing about it, and knows nobody else can do anything about it, and has to live with this burden or choose to die from it. It's very tragic. So, yeah, it's not a lighthearted, happy story, as a lot of science fiction usually isn't, because what these stories usually are a basic commentary on morality. But also, as in Lovecraft's case, he just wanted to make really, really good monsters, and real monsters. Monsters that were supernatural and were actually real. And he did that. So kudos to him. Another kudos to him is that he actually made the very first, like, American myth. Like, you know, Europe has King Arthur, and they have Tolkien, and all these, you know, really great writers who made these really awesome myths, but those are very European Anglo-Saxon myths. There's not a lot of American Anglo-Saxon myths. There's a lot of, you know, like, Native American myths, and there's a lot of very uniquely Native cultures myths. And we have, of course, our urban legends and stuff, but this is like true American science fiction myth. Like, so that's kind of a big deal. He built a whole universe and series of myths even out of this. So kudos to him for being one of the very first Americans to actually make a mythos in American culture. Super exciting about that. What's also really exciting is the era in which it was made. A lot of very tumultuous times, just like any other time really, like political climate, politics, disease is rampant, the whole spiel. Basically, the 20s then are the 20s now, unfortunately. Time tends to repeat itself. But what Lovecraft has done is made a classic, and what kind of stamps a true classic as a classic is not how old it is, but how timeless it is. So that's basically what Lovecraft's done with this. He's made this really timeless fear. By taking all these really common human fears, he's made a really timeless classic, especially a horror classic. So it's really compelling, really great storyline. I didn't use all the spoilers, so there's still plenty to learn, plenty to read about if you aren't familiar with it. So I just really recommend it. It's really well written. There's really complex characters. It's really great myth. It continues on through a whole universe. It's not just a one-shot story. So it's a really good collection of work, and I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it already, please read it. There is a reason it's a classic, especially for people who love fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. It kind of mixes all those things together and really becomes a really great piece of work, and really appeals to a lot of people because of that. There's enough fantasy, there's enough horror, there's enough psychology and mystery and things where it kind of is all kinds of genres mixed into one. So it's a really good read, even if it's not something you would think it's your cup of tea. And I think because it's so culturally relevant and has become such a big part of pop culture now, especially within the last 10 years, I think it's worth reading just for that, because it is popping up in video games and magazine articles, and people are writing spin-offs because it was in public domain and things like that. So really a great piece of work, very, very interesting if you're interested in those kinds of things, those darker works. So yeah, really enjoyed it.
I first read the Call of Cthulhu and a lot of other Lovecraft stories many, many years ago. I was in high school. We're talking about somewhere between 1979 and 1982. And something that I don't think Emily really made clear, which everybody probably knows this, but I'm going to state it anyway. Call of Cthulhu is a short story, and most of the other stories of the Cthulhu mythos are short stories. Lovecraft only wrote a couple of novels, the Case of Charles Dexter Ward and At the Mountains of Madness, and they barely qualify as novels. Case of Charles Dexter Ward is probably more of on the lines of a novella or novelette. It's really not very long. Even though it's been published as a standalone book, it's not a very long piece. So Lovecraft wrote all these short stories that are part of this Cthulhu mythos, and the Call of Cthulhu is just one of those stories. I know I've said previously that nobody before Lovecraft really described their monsters. That's not entirely accurate. Some authors, like Bram Stoker in The Lair of the White Worm, he described his monster pretty well. As a matter of fact, I have the feeling like Lair of the White Worm had a really strong influence on a lot of Lovecraft's work, with the underground monster, kind of influencing and controlling people and creating this weird village. A lot of that runs through Lovecraft's work. Now, not all of Lovecraft's stories are part of the Cthulhu mythos. There are some stories that are standalone stories, like my very favorite Lovecraft story, The Outsider. That has nothing to do with Cthulhu mythos. But a large number of his stories do get set in this same universe with this same mythology driving it. So Lovecraft did change things up quite a bit, in that most, although not all, I was incorrect in saying all, but most horror stories before Lovecraft really left the monsters to the imagination. Monsters were there, but they weren't described very well, and they weren't usually part of this elaborate mythology system. Instead, authors went more for the psychological aspect of horror and terror. Edgar Allan Poe in particular, his work was very psychological. The Gothic writers rarely described actual monsters. Gothic was more about the feeling of the story, and that Gothic feeling was brought into real horror stories. There are other authors that did write about specific monsters, but none of them created this elaborate mythology like Lovecraft did. Again, I may be wrong. I don't know everything, but I'm pretty sure Lovecraft was the first to take it to that level and really, really let his imagination just go wild with creating all these fantastic creatures. The only thing comparable to that are the various world mythologies. In literature for entertainment, you don't see that until Lovecraft. So he did really change the game for horror writing, fantasy writing, by making these things seem a lot more real, describing them, giving them places, giving them physical descriptions, having them standing in front of people, having people actually witness these horrors. And so Lovecraft, his writing is unique. His writing style is unique. There's nothing else quite like, maybe people since then have imitated him. And he was purposely trying to imitate much earlier styles of writing. But in his day, there's nothing quite like him. And he did influence so many authors after that. He influenced August Derleth to start Arkham House, specifically to publish all of Lovecraft's work. um, Derleth put a lot of time and effort into keeping Lovecraft alive through the years when Lovecraft wasn't so well known. And that's another thing in previous videos I have kind of not totally mistakenly said, but maybe exaggerated how little known Lovecraft was before today. He was pretty, Lovecraft would have fallen into obscurity if it wasn't for Arkham House. Arkham House kept him alive, and within the science fiction fantasy genre, Lovecraft was very much alive, very much influencing a lot of writers, writers like Harlan Ellison, and so he was a very heavily influential writer, and his work was very important before our time. He wasn't totally unknown. And in the 1960s, there was quite a bit of a revival, with many of his works being collected into paperback editions. There were movies based on his work. Like I say, other writers in the genre took the Lovecraft ball and ran with it, writing more Cthulhu-style stories, expanding Lovecraft's vision for this whole mythology. People like Robert Bloch, and, well, many other writers since then have added stories to this whole thing. But I didn't see a real explosion in interest with Lovecraft becoming a real literary figure, being taken seriously, being published by Penguin Books, being having very highly renowned literate authors collect his works and write forwards to his works, and you just see collections of Lovecraft everywhere. You see video games based on it and movies based on his stories, and you never saw that until after the mid 1980s, early 1990s. Then there's been this growth of interest in Lovecraft, and it's not really strange that there's been a growth of interest in Lovecraft. What is strange is that there ever was a time when he wasn't taken as a major figure in American literature. That has a lot to do with the fact that magazines like Weird Tales and Amazing Stories and Astounding Stories, where Lovecraft was publishing, these were pulp magazines that were not taken seriously. They were kids' things. Teenage boys read this stuff. It wasn't something that adults would ever read. It wasn't literature. It was childish entertainment back then. In the 20s and 30s, people thought this was childish entertainment, and all the way even up into the 1970s, there were parents that actually tried to push their kids to stop reading this stuff. I remember this one letter that was published in Starlog, where this father wrote to the magazine berating the editor of the magazine for publishing all this trash and getting his kid to be interested in all this science fiction and fantasy garbage, or no, I think I was in Famous Monsters of Filmland, actually, but it was in the 1970s this was published. This guy was just going off on the one of the leading magazines of the genre with how terrible it was that his kid was interested in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. This is the kind of things that were going on before Star Wars. Everybody thought science fiction was horrible, and even in the 1980s, people thought everybody playing Dungeons and Dragons were devil worshippers and Satanists, and that they were going out slaughtering goats and sacrificing virgins. And that was mainly because of one case where some kids who were not right in the head actually murdered somebody. They happened to have also played Dungeons and Dragons. it's kind of hard to believe today, looking backward, that people were so adamantly against the genre. But that's why Lovecraft took so long to become recognized for what he did, because he was part of the whole genre ghetto that science fiction, fantasy, horror was all stuffed into and called garbage. And serious people, serious writers didn't write this stuff. Serious, intelligent people didn't read this stuff. Thank God those days are gone. And we can now enjoy the immense imagination of Lovecraft without being told that we're stupid or devil worshippers or anything like that. So Lovecraft has been an influence on me. The Call of Cthulhu is just one of many stories that influenced me by Lovecraft. It's an excellent story. The Call of Cthulhu is probably important to understanding the whole mythos because of how it introduces you to the actual creature Cthulhu. And I believe that was the first time you really got an accurate description of what Cthulhu looks like, where Cthulhu currently resides, and why there was such a mystery and so much fear around this figure in the whole mythos. Because there are a lot of other gods, a lot of other creatures, and you need to read this one story to understand why Cthulhu is so important to the whole thing. But the whole mythos is worth it, even if you don't read the specific story Call of Cthulhu. Any of the other stories of the Cthulhu mythos are absolute classics, absolute must-reads for anybody that likes imaginative literature. If you only like romance novels, stay away from Lovecraft. If you only like historical novels that talk about generations of important families, things like if you only like novels like War and Peace or The Magnificent Ambersons, you probably want to avoid Lovecraft. But if you love imagination, if you love stories that talk about things other than the real world, things that don't exist, things that are conjured up strictly out of the author's imagination, Lovecraft is one of the most. Lovecraft's stories are among the very most powerful, fascinating stories that you could read. And so, yeah, Emily and I are both very much fans of Lovecraft. And we encourage you to if you haven't read Lovecraft, read him. Maybe he's not going to be for you. It depends on what you like. But if you like horror, read him. His style feels dated, but read past that. His style creates an atmosphere that is essential to the feeling of dread in all of his stories. And he could not have written his stories without that style and still made them as powerful as they are. So that style is very important to the whole Lovecraft mystique. And so if that's something that's going to put you off, if you only like stories that are written in a very current, modern, easy to read style, there again, Lovecraft is not going to be your thing. But if you can deal with that, Lovecraft is going to be amazing.
Thanks for listening, guys. Everybody stay safe. Everybody stay healthy. I hope you're all reading and enjoying yourselves despite the trying times we're in right now. Everybody practice your social distancing. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, please post comments, tell us what you think, tell us what you know, tell me if I said something wrong, call me out. Just interact with us. We really like to hear from you. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys. You have a great night.